Hello, love. It's Clara here, and I'm so glad you found your way to this moment. However your day has been, whatever it held, whatever it asked of you, that's all behind you now. You've done enough. You've been enough. And now there's nothing left to do but rest. I hope you're somewhere comfortable, somewhere soft. Perhaps you can feel the weight of your blankets, the give of your pillow beneath your head. Perhaps the room around you is quiet, or perhaps there are small sounds, the hum of heat through vents, the distant murmur of voices or traffic, the particular silence that settles over a house at night. Whatever surrounds you, let it be exactly as it is. You don't need to change anything. You don't need to do anything at all. Just let yourself be here. Let your body settle into the surface beneath you. Let your shoulders drop just a little. Let your jaw soften. There's no hurry. There's nowhere else you need to be. This moment, this quiet, gentle moment, belongs entirely to you. I want to tell you a story tonight. Not an exciting story, not one with urgency or danger or questions that need answering. Just a quiet story, the kind that moves slowly, like fog rolling in over water, the kind where nothing much happens, and somehow that's exactly what makes it beautiful. It's a story about waiting, about the in-between spaces where we pause and breathe and notice things we usually rush past. About how sometimes the most meaningful moments aren't the destinations we're racing toward, but the pauses along the way. Tonight, I want to take you to a train station. Not a busy one, not the kind filled with morning commuters or holiday travelers or the anxious energy of people running late. This is a different kind of station, the kind you find in smaller cities or on the edges of larger ones, the kind that sees most of its traffic during the day, and then, as evening deepens into night, gradually empties until only a handful of souls remain. Picture it with me, if you will. It's raining, not heavily, but steadily. That soft, persistent rain that sounds like patience itself, the kind that makes you grateful for shelter, for warmth, for the glow of lights against darkness. The station sits at the edge of a neighborhood that's mostly residential. Older buildings, tree-lined streets, the sort of place where people have lived for generations and know which sidewalks flood in heavy rain. The station itself is beautiful in an understated way, built perhaps 70 or 80 years ago when train stations were designed to be gathering places, not just transit points. There's a main hall with high ceilings and tall windows, wooden benches worn smooth by decades of waiting passengers, and overhead lights that cast everything in a warm, amber glow. The floor is pale stone, polished by thousands of footsteps until it shines softly, reflecting the lights above like water. Outside, there are 2 platforms, one for trains heading north into the city, one for trains heading south towards smaller towns, and eventually the coast. Between them, the tracks run parallel, gleaming faintly in the rain. There are covered waiting areas on each platform, simple structures with slanted roofs and benches underneath, protection from the weather without blocking the view. At this hour, and it's late, nearly midnight, the station is almost empty. The ticket office has closed. The small cafe that serves coffee and sandwiches during the day has been dark for hours. The information board still glows, listing departure times in amber letters that flip and change with soft mechanical clicks. But most of the scheduled trains have already passed. There are only a few left now, one at midnight, another at 1:30, a final one just before 3. The people who wait for these late trains are a particular kind of traveler, not business people heading home from work, not tourists with rolling suitcases and guidebooks. These are people who move through the world differently, who travel at odd hours by choice or necessity, who don't mind waiting, who might even prefer it. And tonight, on this rainy evening in early autumn, there are only 3 people waiting at the station. One of them is named Morgan. Morgan is 37, though they feel simultaneously younger and older depending on the moment. Medium height, slender build, with dark hair cut short and practical. They wear a gray wool coat, dark jeans, comfortable boots, the kind of clothes chosen for warmth and function rather than appearance. In one hand, they carry a small leather satchel, worn soft at the edges. In the other, an umbrella, furled and dripping. Morgan has been standing on the northbound platform for perhaps 10 minutes, watching the rain. They're not waiting for the next train. That won't arrive for another hour and 17 minutes. They're simply here, present, letting the evening wash over them like the rain washes over the empty tracks. There's something about train stations late at night that Morgan has always loved, the permission they give you to exist without purpose. During the day, stations are about movement, about getting from one place to another as efficiently as possible. But at night, especially on quiet nights like this, they become something else. They become threshold spaces, places where you're allowed to be in transit, in between, neither here nor there. Places where you can sit and think and simply be, and no one questions why you're there or where you're going or what you're doing with your life. Morgan needs that tonight, needs the permission to simply exist without explanation. They've had a long few weeks, not bad weeks necessarily, nothing dramatic or catastrophic, just dense, heavy, the kind of time that piles up like snow, where each day adds another layer until you're moving through something thick and exhausting without quite knowing when it started. Work has been demanding. Morgan works as a copy editor for a small publishing house, the kind that still cares about semicolons and whether a sentence truly sings or just adequately conveys information. It's work they love, usually, but lately there's been too much of it, too many manuscripts to review, too many deadlines stacking up like planes waiting to land. And there's been other stuff too, small stuff, a friend going through a divorce who needs regular phone calls and reassurance, an aging parent 3 hours away who's too proud to ask for help but clearly needs it, a living situation that's fine but not quite right, roommates who are kind but not really friends, a bedroom that never gets enough light. Nothing Morgan can't handle, nothing unusual, just life, the ordinary weight of being an adult in the world. So tonight, instead of going straight home after a late dinner with a colleague, Morgan got off the subway 3 stops early and walked through the rain to this station. Not because they need to catch a train. They live in the city. They're already home, more or less. But because they need to be somewhere that feels like going somewhere. Somewhere that holds the possibility of departure without requiring them to actually leave. They need to stand on this platform in the rain and remember that the world is larger than their immediate circumstances, that there are tracks leading to other places. That departure is always possible, even if they're not ready to board yet. Morgan leans against one of the metal pillars supporting the platform roof and lets their eyes unfocus slightly. The rain creates a kind of curtain between them and the rest of the world, not heavy enough to obscure, but enough to soften edges, to make everything feel slightly dreamlike. Across the tracks on the southbound platform, they can see another person waiting, a man sitting on one of the benches under the covered area. He's reading something, a book perhaps, though from this distance Morgan can't be sure. He seems utterly absorbed, undisturbed by the lateness of the hour or the rain or the emptiness surrounding him. There's something peaceful about his presence, the way he sits so still, so focused, as if he has all the time in the world, as if this bench, this platform, this rain-soaked night is exactly where he's meant to be. Morgan watches him for a moment, not staring, just observing, and feels something in their chest ease slightly. A reminder that they're not the only person in the world who seeks out these quiet spaces, who understands that sometimes you need to be alone in the presence of strangers, who knows that waiting can be its own kind of arrival. After a while, Morgan shifts their gaze back to the tracks, to the rain, to the distant lights of the city reflected in puddles on the platform. They're in no hurry. The night is long. The rain will continue. And for now, this is exactly where they need to be. Just here. Just breathing. Just waiting. And in that waiting, there's a kind of peace that Morgan hasn't felt in weeks. A loosening, a permission to simply exist without producing, without performing, without proving anything at all. The station holds them gently in its amber light, and somewhere in the back of their mind, Morgan thinks, yes, this is exactly what I needed. This quiet, this rain, this moment of being no one, going nowhere, accountable to nothing but the gentle passage of time. The man on the southbound platform was named James, and he was reading poetry. Not because he particularly loved poetry, though he didn't dislike it, but because poetry was the only thing that seemed to match the rhythm of late-night train stations. Prose moved too quickly, demanded too much sustained attention, but poetry could be read in the spaces between moments, a stanza, then a pause to listen to the rain, another stanza, then time to watch a distant train pass on the express tracks, its windows glowing like a string of golden beads pulled through the darkness. James was 43, though he'd stopped thinking about his age in terms of years and started thinking about it in terms of stages. He was in the stage of life where his body made small noises when he stood up too quickly, where he'd started preferring tea to coffee in the evenings, where he'd accumulated enough experience to know that very few things were as urgent as they seemed in the moment. He had a kind face, the sort of face that made strangers feel comfortable asking him for directions or the time. Gray-green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, brown hair going silver at the temples, a neat beard, more silver than brown now. He wore a dark blue sweater under a tan raincoat, corduroys, shoes that were sensible rather than stylish. In his lap, the book, a collection of poems by a writer he'd never heard of before finding it at a used bookstore 3 days ago. The cover was soft with age, the pages slightly yellowed. Someone before him had underlined certain passages in pencil, carefully, as if marking moments that mattered. James liked that, the idea that he was reading a book that had already meant something to someone else, that these words had already done their work of comfort or provocation or beauty and were ready to do it again. He came to this station every Thursday night, had been doing so for nearly 2 years now, ever since the divorce was finalized, and he'd moved into a small apartment on the south side of the city and realized he needed rituals to structure his new solitude. Thursday had always been his favorite day of the week, not as demanding as the beginning of the week, not as exhausted as Friday, not as long as the weekend stretched out before Sunday's inevitable melancholy. Thursday felt like a breath held between obligations, and Thursday nights, specifically late Thursday nights, felt like stolen time, time that belonged to no one, not even himself, really. Time he could spend however he wished, without guilt or explanation. So every Thursday, James finished whatever work needed finishing. He was an accountant, reliable and precise, the kind of person people trusted with their taxes and retirement planning. And then he'd make himself a light dinner, change into comfortable clothes, and take the subway to this station. He never actually caught a train. That wasn't the point. The point was the waiting, the being there, the sitting on this particular bench on the southbound platform while rain fell and trains occasionally passed, and the world continued its quiet turning without requiring anything from him. Sometimes he brought a book, sometimes a notebook, though he rarely wrote more than a few scattered thoughts. Sometimes just himself, his thoughts, and the willingness to sit with both. Tonight, the poetry. He was reading a poem about autumn, about the way trees let go of their leaves without drama or resistance, just a gradual releasing, a trust in the cycle of things. The poet compared it to grief, to the way we eventually stop clutching so tightly to what's already gone and allow ourselves to become bare, to enter winter, to wait for whatever comes next. James read the same stanza 3 times, letting the words settle into him. Yes, he thought, yes, that's exactly it. His marriage had ended 2 years ago, but he was only now really feeling its absence. At first, there'd been too much to do, paperwork and lawyers and the logistics of separating 2 lives that had been intertwined for 16 years. Then there'd been the numbness, the strange relief of quiet after years of low-level tension. Then the busyness of building a new routine, a new life, a new understanding of himself as singular rather than plural. But now, in the second autumn after the end, he was finally letting himself grieve. Not the loss of his ex-wife specifically. They'd both known the marriage was over long before it officially ended, and they'd parted with sadness, but also with something like gratitude for what they'd shared. But the loss of the future he'd imagined. the life he'd thought he'd be living at 43, the version of himself he'd expected to be. That person was gone. Those possibilities had fallen away, the way leaves fall from trees, and James was learning to let them go, learning to stand bare and uncertain and trust that this, too, was part of the cycle. That winter had its own kind of beauty. That waiting was sometimes exactly the right thing to do. He looked up from his book, letting his eyes rest on the rain. It was coming down a little harder now, drumming softly on the platform roof above him. Across the tracks on the northbound platform, he could see the figure of another person, someone standing near the edge of the covered area, looking out at the night. Too far away to see clearly, but he could make out the shape of them, the stillness. Another person who understood the value of this particular kind of solitude. James felt a quiet kinship with them, whoever they were, a recognition of shared understanding even without speaking, without knowing anything about each other beyond the fact that they were both here, both choosing to spend their Thursday night at a nearly empty train station instead of anywhere else they could have been. The world was full of people, James had learned, but only some of them understood about waiting, about sitting still, about letting time pass without trying to fill it with productivity or distraction or constant stimulation. Those were his people, the waiters, the observers, the ones who could be alone without being lonely, who could be still without being bored. He returned to his book to the next poem, something about rain, naturally, and let himself sink back into the gentle rhythm of words and silence, while the night deepened around him and the station held them all. Him, the stranger across the tracks, whoever else might be sheltering in the warm-lit waiting room inside, in its patient embrace. Time passed. James wasn't sure how much. He never wore a watch on Thursday nights. Time was something to be experienced, not measured. He finished the rain poem, started another about trains, about the way they disappear into distance and darkness, about the lives of people passing through stations without stopping, ships in the night, all of us moving in our own directions, occasionally visible to each other but never quite connecting. It was a melancholy poem, but gently so, not despairing, just acknowledging the truth of human separateness, the way we're all fundamentally alone, even in crowds, even in relationships, even lying beside someone in the dark. James didn't find this thought depressing. There was something freeing about it, actually. Once you accepted that no one could truly know you, not completely, not the way you knew yourself, then you could stop demanding that from people. Stop being disappointed when they couldn't read your mind, or anticipate your needs, or understand the specific texture of your inner life. You could just appreciate them for what they could offer, for their presence, for the moments of connection that were possible, even if complete understanding wasn't. His ex-wife used to accuse him of being too comfortable with distance. "You're like an island," she'd say, not cruelly, just observing. "Complete unto yourself. Sometimes I don't think you need anyone." He tried to explain that it wasn't about not needing people. It was about not needing them to complete him. He'd been whole before her, was whole with her, would be whole after her. That didn't diminish what they shared. It just meant he was bringing his wholeness to meet her wholeness, not expecting her to fill in his gaps. She hadn't understood, or maybe she had understood and just needed something different, someone who needed her in a more desperate, clinging way, someone who would fall apart without her. James couldn't be that person, wouldn't want to be, even if he could. So they'd separated, and he'd continued being an island, and he'd found that he was okay with that. More than okay. There was a deep peace in knowing himself as fundamentally complete, in knowing that other people were gifts, not necessities. That connection was beautiful precisely because it wasn't required. He closed the book, marked his place with a small piece of paper he'd been using as a bookmark. The station's information board clicked softly, updating departure times. The next train, the one he wouldn't catch, would arrive in 43 minutes. James stood, stretched carefully, felt his knees make their small sounds of protest. He walked to the edge of the platform, staying under the roof's protection, and looked out at the rain. It had eased slightly, become almost a mist. The kind of rain that's more atmosphere than precipitation. The kind that makes you feel like you're inside a cloud, wrapped in gentle obscurity. He glanced across to the northbound platform. The person who'd been standing there had moved. They were sitting now on one of the benches, their posture relaxed. James couldn't see what they were doing. Just sitting, perhaps. Just being. He felt that kinship again, that recognition of someone else who understood. For a moment, he considered crossing over, walking through the main hall up the stairs to the other platform, introducing himself, making some comment about the rain or the lateness of the hour, seeing if this stranger might want to share some small conversation to pass the time. But he didn't. Some connections were meant to remain distant. Some fellow feeling was better appreciated from afar without the complication of actual interaction. They were both here for solitude, after all, for the gift of being alone in the presence of others, not alone together. James returned to his bench, sat back down, opened his book to a new page. Another poem, this one about stars, about the way they're always there even when you can't see them, hidden behind clouds or daylight, but constant nonetheless. He read slowly, savoring each word. No hurry, no destination. Just this, words and rain, and the quiet company of strangers who understood about waiting. And in that waiting, James found what he came here for every Thursday night. Not escape exactly, not even peace, though there was that. What he found was permission. Permission to be exactly himself, no more, no less. Permission to take up space in the world without justifying it. Permission to spend his Thursday nights sitting on a train platform reading poetry in the rain, for no better reason than because it fed something in his soul that needed feeding. That was enough, more than enough. The world didn't need to understand. He barely understood it himself, but it was his. This ritual, this night, this quiet choosing of how to spend his time and attention, his. And that made all the difference. Inside the station's main hall, in the warm glow of the overhead lights, a third person sat on one of the long wooden benches. Her name was Elise, and she was 29, and she was trying very hard not to cry. Not because anything terrible had happened. Nothing had happened, really. That was part of the problem. Her life was fine, objectively fine, even good by most measures, and yet she felt like she was slowly suffocating under the weight of its fineness. Elise was small-boned and delicate-looking in a way that people often mistook for fragility. Pale skin, dark eyes, brown hair that she wore long and usually pulled back in a practical braid. Tonight, she wore jeans and a soft green sweater, a gray cardigan over it, white sneakers. Her backpack sat beside her on the bench, small, navy blue, containing a book she wasn't reading, a water bottle, a wallet, keys to an apartment she didn't want to return to yet. She'd been sitting here for over an hour now, just sitting, watching people come and go during the earlier part of the evening, and then watching as the crowd thinned, until there was almost no one left. The station was warm, almost too warm after the chill of the rain outside. Elise had walked here from her office, a 40-minute walk in the rain, no umbrella, because she'd needed to feel something. Needed the cold water on her face, the discomfort of wet clothes, some sensation sharp enough to cut through the numbness that had been growing in her for weeks now. She worked at a nonprofit that did advocacy work for housing justice. It was good work, important work, work she'd thought would fulfill her when she'd taken the position 18 months ago. And it did fulfill her in some ways. She believed in what they were doing. She liked her colleagues. She was good at her job, research and writing mostly, synthesizing complex policy information into clear, compelling narratives. But somewhere along the way, the work had become just work. The passion had leaked out of it, replaced by routine and deadlines, and the grinding realization that they were making such incremental progress against such enormous problems. Every small victory was immediately swallowed by 10 new crises. Every policy change they won was gutted or reversed within months. They were bailing water from a sinking ship, and Elise was tired. So tired. And it wasn't just work, it was everything. Her relationship had ended 3 months ago. Not dramatically, just a slow recognition that she and Marcus were growing in different directions, wanting different things, staying together more out of habit than love. They'd parted kindly, maturely, with hugs and wishes for each other's happiness. But maturity didn't make it hurt less. She missed him, not the reality of him, the way he'd leave dishes in the sink, his refusal to talk about feelings until they'd calcified into resentments, but the idea of him, the having someone, the not being alone. She'd moved into a new apartment with 2 roommates she'd found on the internet. They were nice enough, quiet, respectful. They all stayed out of each other's way, but it felt temporary, like a way station, not a home. She'd been sleeping on a borrowed mattress on the floor for 3 months, telling herself she'd buy a real bed frame once she figured out where she actually wanted to live, but unable to muster the energy or conviction to decide. Her friends had started to feel distant. not because they'd done anything wrong, but because Elise had stopped being able to pretend she was okay. When they'd ask how she was doing, she'd say, "Fine," or "hanging in there," or, the usual. But the words felt like lies even as she spoke them. And eventually, she just stopped reaching out, let the texts go unanswered for days, declined invitations to drinks or dinners, retreated into the kind of solitude that was less peaceful than it was necessary. She wasn't depressed exactly. She knew what depression felt like. She'd been there before in college, that gray fog where nothing mattered and everything was effort. This was different. She wasn't numb to everything. She still laughed at stupid videos online, still cried during touching commercials, still felt the full range of human emotion. What she felt was untethered, like she'd slipped loose from all the moorings that usually held a life in place: work, relationship, home, friendships. All the structures that gave shape to existence had simultaneously become unreliable, and she was drifting now, unanchored, not sure where the current was taking her or whether she should even try to swim against it. Tonight, she'd worked late finishing a report that was due tomorrow, left the office around 10, stood on the sidewalk in the rain, and realized she didn't want to go home, didn't want to walk into that temporary apartment with its bare walls and borrowed furniture, heat up some leftovers, scroll through her phone until her eyes went blurry, and fall asleep still feeling like she was waiting for her real life to start. So she'd walked, let the rain soak through her clothes, let her feet carry her without conscious direction, and somehow, though not surprisingly, not really, she'd ended up here. At this train station she'd passed dozens of times but never entered. Because train stations were about going somewhere, and she had nowhere to go, nowhere she wanted to be except not here. But inside, the station was warm and quiet and beautiful in its old-fashioned way. The high ceilings, the amber lights, the worn wooden benches that had held so many waiting bodies over so many years. It felt like a place where it was acceptable to not know what came next, where being in transit was the entire point. So Elise had found this bench, sat down, and simply stayed. She wasn't waiting for a train. She had no destination, but something about being in a place designed for waiting made her own directionless feel less like failure and more like pause, intermission, the moment between acts when the house lights come up and you're allowed to stretch, breathe, recalibrate before the story continues. She watched an elderly couple leave through the main entrance, the man holding the door for the woman, their hands finding each other automatically as they stepped into the rain. She watched a young person in a bright yellow jacket hurry through with a rolling suitcase, checking their phone anxiously, probably late for something. She watched a station worker in a reflective vest walk the length of the hall with a broom, sweeping slowly, methodically, the way someone sweeps when they're not in a hurry, when the sweeping itself is meditation. And gradually, as the last of the evening passengers departed and the station settled into its late-night stillness, Elise felt something in her chest begin to ease. She wasn't okay. She didn't have answers. She still didn't know what she was doing with her life, or where she was going, or how to bridge the gap between who she was and who she wanted to be. But here, in this warm-lit hall, surrounded by strangers who were also waiting for something, or nothing, or everything, she didn't have to be okay. She didn't have to have answers. She could just sit, just be, just let herself exist in this in-between space without demanding more from herself than simple presence. After a while, Elise stood. She needed to move to feel her body. She walked the length of the hall, her footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. Past the closed ticket office with its old-fashioned window and brass fixtures. Past the cafe, dark now, chairs stacked on tables. Past the departure board with its amber letters and soft mechanical clicks. She stopped at the tall windows overlooking the northbound platform. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see a figure sitting on one of the benches. Someone choosing, like her, to spend their night here. Someone else who needed the permission that stations gave. Elise pressed her palm against the cold glass, felt the temperature difference between the warm interior and the cold night outside, watched the person across the way, too far to see clearly, just a silhouette. Just another human being existing in space and time. She wondered about them. What had brought them here? What were they waiting for, if anything? Were they okay? Were they also trying to figure out how to keep going when all the maps had dissolved and the compass was spinning uselessly? Or maybe they were fine. Maybe they were just someone who liked train stations, who found peace in these liminal spaces, who wasn't running from anything but simply choosing to be here because here was interesting or beautiful or different from wherever else they could have been. Elise hoped they were okay, hoped that whatever had brought them to this platform on this rainy night was something gentle rather than desperate. Hoped they found whatever it was they were looking for, or the peace of not needing to look at all. She turned away from the window, continued her slow circuit of the hall. Near the far end, she found a little alcove she hadn't noticed before, probably once a phone booth, from the days when people needed such things. The phone was gone, but the alcove remained, a small wooden bench built into the wall, barely wide enough for one person, with carved details in the woodwork that spoke of an earlier era's craftsmanship. Elise sat down. The alcove faced away from the main hall, creating a pocket of privacy, a place within the place. She pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them, let her head rest against the wall, and finally she let herself cry. Not dramatically, not with sobs or noise, just quiet tears that slipped down her face while her shoulders stayed still. A release, an acknowledgement of the sadness she'd been carrying, the confusion, the exhaustion of trying to hold everything together when everything kept slipping through her fingers. She cried for her job that felt meaningless, for her relationship that had ended not with betrayal, but with the sadder recognition of incompatibility, for her apartment that wasn't a home, for her friends who she'd let slip away, for her younger self who'd thought that by 29 she'd have it figured out, whatever it was. She cried for the gap between expectation and reality, for the weight of trying to be okay when you're not, for the loneliness of feeling like everyone else has received the instruction manual for adult life except you. And then, after a while, the tears slowed, stopped, Elise wiped her face with her sleeve, took a deep breath, let it out slowly. She felt lighter, not fixed. Nothing was fixed, but lighter, as if crying had created some small space inside her chest where before there'd been only pressure. She sat in her alcove for a long time, listening to the ambient sounds of the station, the hum of heating vents, the distant sound of rain, the occasional mechanical click of the departure board updating, the faraway rumble of a train passing on the express tracks, not stopping, just passing through this moment on its way to somewhere else. Eventually, she heard footsteps, someone walking through the main hall. She stayed still, hidden in her alcove, and watched as a figure passed, the station worker with the broom, making another slow circuit. He moved with the unhurried patience of someone who'd done this task thousands of times and would do it thousands more. There was something comforting about that, about the continuity of it, about knowing that long after tonight ended, someone would still be here, sweeping these floors, tending to this space. The worker passed out of view and Elise was alone again. But it was a different kind of alone now, not the suffocating aloneness she'd felt earlier, but something gentler. The aloneness of being one person among many, all of them moving through their own nights, their own struggles, their own moments of not knowing. She pulled out her phone, something she'd been avoiding, knowing it would pull her back into the world of obligations and expectations and the need to respond, to perform, to be okay for other people's consumption. But maybe that was all right too. Maybe she could look at her phone and not lose this moment, not lose this small piece she'd found in the alcove of an old train station, while rain fell outside and strangers waited on platforms, and the world continued its patient turning. 3 text messages, one from her roommate asking if she'd be home tonight. No urgency, just checking. One from her mother, sent hours ago. Thinking of you, honey. Call when you can. One from a friend she hadn't seen in weeks. Hey, stranger, miss your face? Coffee soon? Elise smiled despite herself. These small tethers, these threads of connection that persisted even when she'd stopped tending them. Maybe they were enough. Maybe she didn't need a grand purpose or perfect clarity or a life that made sense in every dimension. Maybe she just needed this, people who thought of her, work that mattered, even imperfectly, a place to rest, even temporarily, and nights like this when she could sit in a train station and cry and feel lighter for it. She typed back to her roommate, "Be home late, all good." To her mother, "Love you, we'll call this weekend." To her friend, "Yes, coffee, I'd like that." Small commitments, small connections, small steps forward, or at least sideways, which was still movement, which was still better than feeling frozen in place. Elise put her phone away, stood, stretched. She should probably go home soon. Not yet, but soon. For now, she'd stay a little longer, sit in this warm hall, watch the rain through tall windows, exist in this in-between space where she didn't have to be anything except present. And somehow that was enough. Morgan had moved from standing to sitting about 20 minutes ago, though they hadn't really kept track of time. There was something freeing about not knowing exactly when things happened, about letting moments blur together without marking their boundaries. They sat on the bench closest to the platform's edge, legs crossed, hands in their coat pockets. Their umbrella rested beside them, still furled, dripping slowly onto the platform. They'd stopped watching the rain actively and instead let it become ambient, just part of the environment, like the lights or the occasional distant sounds of the city or their own breathing. They were thinking about their life, but not in the anxious, spinning way that usually characterized their thinking. More like observation, like they were standing beside themselves, watching their own thoughts move through like clouds across a sky. Morgan thought about their apartment, which was fine but not home. Their roommates, who were kind but not close. The distance between fine and good, between functioning and flourishing. It was a distance they'd been living in for years now, and they were tired of it. Tired of adequate. Tired of making do. But what was the alternative? Start over somewhere new? Chase some vision of a different life that might turn out to be just as mediocre once they got there? Or stay where they were and try to transform adequate into something better, even though they'd been trying that for 3 years now with no real success? These were the thoughts that usually kept Morgan up at night, cycling and cycling without resolution. But here, on this platform, with rain falling and the night deepening and no particular place they had to be, the thoughts didn't have their usual urgency. They were just thoughts. They'd be there tomorrow, next week, next month. They didn't need to be solved right now. Morgan heard footsteps on the stairs that connected the northbound platform to the main hall. They looked up, expecting perhaps another late traveler. Instead, they saw a young woman emerge onto the platform, mid to late 20s, dark hair, green sweater under a gray cardigan. She paused at the top of the stairs, looking around as if getting her bearings. The woman walked slowly along the platform, staying under the roof's protection, her hands in her pockets. She had the posture of someone who was tired, but not in a hurry. Someone who was here for the same reason Morgan was. Not because they needed to be, but because they chose to be. She took a seat on a bench, perhaps 20 feet from Morgan's. Far enough for privacy, close enough for companionship. The perfect distance for shared solitude. Morgan wanted to say something. Hello, nice night for rain. Do you come here often? But the words felt intrusive. Wrong for the moment. This wasn't a place for conversation. It was a place for parallel existence, for being alone together without demanding anything from each other. So Morgan stayed quiet, and the woman seemed content with that. She sat with her knees pulled up slightly, her arms wrapped around them, gazing out at the rain with an expression that was hard to read from this distance. Not quite sad, not quite peaceful. Something in between, something complicated. They sat like that for a while, the two of them, on the same platform but occupying their own worlds. And there was something beautiful about it, something right. Two strangers choosing the same strange thing, to spend their Thursday night at a nearly empty train station, and being able to share the space without needing to explain or connect or justify. Morgan thought about all the people moving through the city right now, in apartments, in bars, in taxis, in their own homes. All those separate lives, separate stories, separate struggles and joys. And most of the time, we never see each other, never know what anyone else is carrying or thinking or feeling. We're all so isolated in our own experiences, even when we're surrounded by millions of other people. But sometimes, in places like this, in moments like this, the isolation felt less like loneliness and more like, what? Shared humanity? Recognition that we're all doing this strange, hard, beautiful thing called being alive, and none of us really know what we're doing, and that's okay. That's just how it is. Morgan watched the woman from the corner of their eye, watched her breathe, shift slightly, pull her cardigan tighter, watched her simply be, and felt grateful for her presence, for the way it made the platform feel less empty without making it feel crowded, for the reminder that they weren't the only person who needed this particular kind of refuge. After a while, Morgan stood, stretched, decided to walk a bit, to move their body, to feel their legs and feet and the solidity of the platform beneath them. They walked slowly toward the far end of the platform, past the woman, keeping a respectful distance. She glanced up briefly as Morgan passed, and their eyes met for just a second. The woman gave a small, soft smile, not greeting exactly, just acknowledgement. "Hello, fellow human. I see you're also here." Morgan smiled back, nodded slightly, kept walking. At the end of the platform, there was a good view of the tracks stretching away into darkness. The rain had picked up again slightly, creating a kind of shimmer in the air where the platform lights hit it. Morgan leaned against the railing. Carefully, it was wet, and looked out. They thought about trains, about how they're always going somewhere, how the tracks lead to other cities, other towns, other lives, how every single person on every single train was in the middle of their own story, going home or leaving home, visiting someone or saying goodbye, starting something or ending something, or just existing in between. What would it be like, Morgan wondered, to just board a train without knowing where it was going, to choose departure without destination, to let the journey itself be the point rather than where you ended up? It was a romantic idea, probably foolish in practice. You'd run out of money, for one thing, and you'd eventually have to stop somewhere, and then you'd just be in a different place with the same old problems, because problems aren't really about place. They're about you, about what you carry inside yourself. But still, the idea had appeal, the fantasy of escape, of starting over, of becoming someone new by virtue of being somewhere new. Morgan sighed. They weren't going to board a train tonight. They knew that. They'd walk home eventually, through the rain, back to their adequate apartment and their kind but distant roommates and their demanding job and their life that was fine but not quite right. But for now, they could stand here and imagine, could let themselves feel the possibility of elsewhere, could appreciate that the world was large and full of other places, even if they weren't ready to go to them yet. Behind them, they heard more footsteps on the stairs. Morgan turned, curious. It was a man, middle-aged, glasses, reading a book even as he climbed the steps, somehow managing not to trip. He emerged onto the platform, closed his book with care, looked around with the expression of someone returning to a familiar place. He walked to the bench the young woman was sitting on, not the exact same bench, but the one adjacent to it, and sat down with a small sigh of satisfaction. Then he opened his book again, adjusted his glasses, and settled in as if he had all the time in the world. Morgan watched this with quiet fascination. So there were 3 of them now, 3 people who'd independently chosen to spend their night here. 3 separate stories, 3 separate reasons, 3 separate internal worlds, all temporarily sharing this physical space. It made Morgan feel less alone, and also more alone in the best way. Alone in the sense of being separate, distinct, autonomous, not needing to merge with anyone else or explain themselves or justify their choices, but also connected by virtue of choosing the same strange thing. Morgan stayed at the far end of the platform a while longer, then slowly made their way back toward their original bench. As they passed the man with the book, he looked up briefly and nodded, that same acknowledgement the woman had given. "Hello, fellow human. Nice night for this, whatever this is." Morgan nodded back, kept walking, returned to their seat. The 3 of them sat on the northbound platform, the woman with her knees pulled up, the man with his book, Morgan with their hands in their pockets. Rain fell. Time passed. No trains came. The next one wasn't due for at least another half hour. And in that waiting, in that shared solitude, something peaceful settled over the platform. Something that felt almost sacred. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, even if you can't articulate why. Morgan closed their eyes, listened to the rain, felt their breathing slow and deepen. Thought about nothing in particular, just existed, just was. And for the first time in weeks, that felt like enough. James had noticed the other 2 people on the northbound platform, though he tried not to stare. There was an art to being present with strangers without making them uncomfortable, and James had learned it well over his years of late-night station visits. He'd seen the first person, slender, dark-haired, standing at first and then sitting when he'd arrived earlier in the evening. And just a few minutes ago, the woman in the green sweater had come up the stairs, settled onto a bench nearby. Now there were 3 of them on that platform, and James found himself wondering about them. What brought people to train stations late at night when they clearly weren't catching trains? He knew his own reasons, but theirs, he could only imagine. Maybe they were lonely. Maybe they were hiding. Maybe they just liked the atmosphere the same way he did. Maybe they were writers gathering material, or insomniacs passing time, or heartbroken souls looking for somewhere to exist while they stitched themselves back together. Whatever their reasons, James felt a kinship with them, a quiet gratitude for their presence, even across the distance of the tracks. They made the station feel lived in, made his own ritual feel less eccentric, more like one variation on a common theme. He returned to his book. He'd been reading the same page for 5 minutes now without absorbing it, but that was fine. The book was a companion, not a task. He let his eyes move over the words without demanding that they cohere into meaning. Instead, he found himself thinking about his life, about the choices he'd made and the choices he hadn't, about the way time keeps moving forward whether you're ready or not, whether you're paying attention or not. 43 years. How had that happened? He still felt like himself at 17, at 25, at 30. The same consciousness, the same sense of being James. But the world had changed around him. His body had changed. His circumstances had changed. The person he'd thought he'd become had diverged from the person he actually was. He'd thought at 20 that by 43 he'd be established, settled. He'd imagined a thriving career, maybe partner at an accounting firm, or perhaps he'd have taken that leap and become a financial advisor, working for himself. He'd imagined a family, kids in high school by now, a house with a yard, a dog, weekend barbecues, the whole comfortable suburban package. Instead, divorced, living in a small apartment, still doing steady but unexceptional work for the same firm he'd joined 20 years ago. No kids. That decision had been mutual, one of the few things he and his ex-wife had agreed on completely. No dog, no yard, no barbecues. But also, no stress about college funds or mortgage payments or maintaining a house or navigating the complications of parenting. No feeling trapped by expectations or obligations or the needs of people who depended on him. No slow accumulation of resentments that come from sacrificing your own wants for the sake of family harmony. He had freedom, solitude, time to sit in train stations and read poetry, time to think his own thoughts without interruption, time to become whoever he was going to become without having to negotiate it with anyone else. Was that better? Worse? Neither? James didn't know. Some days it felt like loss. Other days it felt like liberation. Tonight it just felt like what was. His life. The actual shape of it, as opposed to the shape he'd once imagined. And maybe that was okay. Maybe the gap between imagination and reality wasn't failure. It was just adjustment, course correction. The difference between who you think you'll be at 20 and who you actually are at 43. He looked up from his book, across the tracks to the northbound platform. The three figures were still there, each absorbed in their own world. The person who'd been there first was sitting very still, hands in pockets, face turned slightly upward as if watching the rain or the sky or their own thoughts. The woman in the green sweater had shifted position, was now sitting with her legs crossed, one arm wrapped around her middle in a posture that suggested either cold or self-comfort. And there was a third person now. James hadn't seen them arrive, but they were there, standing near the far end of the platform, looking out at the tracks. Three strangers, 3 lives, 3 complicated internal worlds that James would never know or understand. But he could witness them, could appreciate their presence, could feel less alone in his own strangeness by virtue of their shared participation in this particular kind of night. The departure board clicked, updated. 27 minutes until the next train. James's train, theoretically, though he had no intention of boarding it. He wondered if any of them would board, if any of them were actually waiting for transportation, or if they were all here for the same reason he was, for the space itself, the permission it gave to exist without purpose. He'd know soon enough. Or he wouldn't. It didn't really matter. James closed his book completely, set it beside him on the bench, removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, put them back on, stood, stretched, felt his back make small popping sounds as vertebrae shifted, decided to walk a bit, work out the stiffness of sitting. He walked the length of the southbound platform slowly, feeling his body, noticing small aches and tightnesses, breathing into them. Walked past empty benches and puddles reflecting overhead lights and the gentle sound of rain on metal and stone. At the far end, he paused. From here, he had a good view of the main hall's tall windows. Through them, he could see into the warm-lit interior. Someone was sitting on one of the benches inside. He could just make out their silhouette. Another person choosing to spend their night here. 4 of them then, maybe more that he couldn't see. A small community of strangers who'd independently decided that a train station late on a rainy Thursday night was exactly where they needed to be. James found this deeply comforting, the evidence that he wasn't alone in his peculiarity, that other people also needed these liminal spaces, these in-between times, these moments of permission to simply exist. He walked back to his bench, sat down, opened his book again, found a poem he'd read before but wanted to read again. Something about the way we carry our past selves with us, all the versions of who we've been nested inside each other like Russian dolls. The child you were still inside you, the teenager, the young adult, all of them present, all of them still real in some sense, even as you keep adding new layers, new versions, new ways of being yourself. James read it slowly, letting each line sink in. Yes, that was true. He was still 17-year-old James, devastated by his father's death, trying to be strong for his grieving mother. Still 25-year-old James, standing at the altar with his bride, believing they'd figure it out together. Still 35-year-old James, realizing his marriage was ending, feeling both sad and relieved in equal measure. All of those Jameses were still here, still part of him, and they always would be. You don't stop being who you were. You just add new layers, new dimensions. You become more complex, more contradictory, more yourself. He liked that idea, found it less lonely than the alternative, the idea that we shed our past selves like snakeskin, becoming entirely new people, losing connection with who we'd been. No, we carry it all, the joy and the grief and the mistakes and the triumphs and the ordinary Tuesday afternoons when nothing much happened, but we were alive. We were here. We were ourselves. James sat with that thought, letting it settle, letting it become part of his understanding. Across the tracks, he noticed that the person in the green sweater had stood up. She was walking slowly along the platform, her hands in her pockets, her posture thoughtful. She walked the length of it, then back, then sat down on a different bench. This one closer to where James was sitting, though still across the tracks. From this angle, with the light hitting her face differently, James could see her more clearly. She looked young, late 20s maybe. She looked tired, but there was something peaceful about her now, something that hadn't been there earlier when she'd first arrived, as if she'd worked through something, found some small resolution or acceptance. James hoped she was okay, hoped that whatever had brought her here had been resolved, or at least eased, hoped she'd found what she needed. The rain was easing now, becoming lighter, softer, the kind of rain that was more suggestion than precipitation, the kind that could go on for hours without ever becoming a storm, just this patient, gentle falling. James checked the departure board. 15 minutes until the next train. He wouldn't board it. He never did. He'd wait until it came and went, and then he'd wait a little longer, and then eventually he'd gather his things and walk home through the rain and feel grateful for the evening he'd been given. But for now, he'd sit. He'd watch the rain and the strangers and the slow turning of time. He'd read another poem, or maybe just sit with his thoughts. He'd exist in this warm pocket of light and steel and humanity while the world outside continued its complicated business. And that was enough. More than enough. That was everything he needed. Elise had returned to the platform feeling lighter, clearer, more herself. The crying had helped. The walking had helped. The texts she'd sent, small bridges back to the world, had helped. She wasn't fixed, but she felt less broken, less like she was dissolving and more like she was just in transition between versions of herself, between chapters, in the middle of a story that hadn't ended yet. She'd chosen a bench closer to the tracks this time, wanting to feel more connected to the openness, the possibility of elsewhere. She sat down, pulled her cardigan tighter. It was cold now that she'd been still for a while, and looked out at the rain. The other person on the platform, the one with dark hair, hands in pockets, was still there, sitting quietly. And now there was a third person standing at the far end, looking out at something Elise couldn't see from this angle. She liked that they were all here together, but separate. Liked that no one was trying to make conversation or connection. They were just being, existing alongside each other, bearing witness to each other's solitude without intruding on it. It reminded her of something she'd read once about parallel play, the way very young children play near each other without actually playing together, each absorbed in their own activity, their own world, but somehow comforted by proximity. Not alone, but not together either. Something in between. Maybe adults needed that too. Maybe that's what places like this offered. Parallel existence, shared solitude, the comfort of nearness without the demands of interaction. Elise watched the person at the far end of the platform. They were very still, just standing, looking out. She wondered what they were thinking about, what had brought them here, whether they were okay. She hoped they were okay. She hoped everyone was okay. It was one of the hardest parts of being alive, Elise thought, carrying your own pain while also being aware that everyone around you was carrying theirs. That every person you passed on the street had their own complicated inner life, their own struggles, their own moments of despair and hope and confusion. It could be overwhelming if you thought about it too much. All that suffering, all that difficulty, all those people just trying to make it through their days with some measure of grace and dignity. But there was also something beautiful about it, something connecting. We're all in this together, even when we're isolated in our own experiences. We're all trying to figure it out. We're all doing the best we can. Elise pulled out her phone again, looked at the time. Nearly 1 in the morning. She should probably go home soon, but not yet. Not quite yet. She opened her notes app, started typing. Not anything formal, just thoughts, fragments, trying to capture something about this night, this feeling, this moment of being suspended between who she'd been and who she was becoming. She wrote, "Sometimes you need to sit in a train station at midnight and remember that the world is bigger than your immediate problems, that there are tracks leading to other places, that other people are also struggling and also okay. That transition is not the same as being lost." She read it back to herself. It wasn't profound, it wasn't poetry, but it was true. It was what she needed to remember. She kept typing, "I don't know what comes next. I don't know how to fix any of the things that feel broken. But I'm here. I'm breathing. I'm capable of feeling both sad and peaceful at the same time. And maybe that's enough for tonight." Elise saved the note, put her phone away, looked up at the person across the tracks, the one sitting on the southbound platform, reading. From this angle, she could see him more clearly. Middle-aged man, glasses, absorbed in his book. He looked content, like someone who'd found what they were looking for, or had stopped looking and found peace in that. She envied that, the appearance of settledness, of having figured something out. But maybe that was illusion. Maybe he was just as confused as she was, just better at sitting with it, just further along in accepting that confusion was permanent, not something to be solved. The rain had become very light now, almost stopping. The air felt different, softer, fresher, like the city was exhaling after holding its breath. Elise stood, stretched, felt her joints protest slightly. She'd been sitting still for too long. She walked to the edge of the platform, careful not to get too close to the tracks, and looked down their length. They stretched away into darkness, parallel lines disappearing into distance. She thought about paths, about how sometimes you can see where they go and sometimes you can't, about how you have to choose to step onto them anyway, even without knowing the destination. Her life felt like that right now, like standing at the beginning of a path that disappeared into fog. She could see the first few steps, go to work tomorrow, finish the report, respond to emails, exist through another day. But beyond that, no idea, no clarity, just fog and uncertainty and the hope that the path continued even when she couldn't see it. But maybe that was okay. Maybe nobody actually saw more than a few steps ahead. They just pretended they did. Maybe everyone was making it up as they went, building the path under their feet as they walked. That thought was both terrifying and freeing. Terrifying because there was no map, no guarantee, no safety net. Freeing because if there was no right path, then there was no wrong one either. Just movement, just choice, just one step, and then another, until eventually you looked back and saw that you'd gone somewhere after all. Elise walked back to her bench, sat down. The departure board clicked, updated. 8 minutes until the next train. She wondered if she should catch it, just board it, see where it went, have an adventure, start over somewhere new. But she knew she wouldn't. She'd walk home, back to her temporary apartment, and her borrowed mattress and her life that felt like it was on hold. Because that was her path right now. That was her fog, and she needed to walk through it, not around it. The other two people on the platform were still there, the dark-haired one sitting quietly, the one at the far end now walking slowly back toward the center. Three strangers sharing a space, sharing a night, sharing nothing and everything at the same time. Elise felt grateful for them, for their silent companionship, for the way their presence made the platform feel less lonely without making her feel obligated to connect. She checked her phone one more time. No new messages. That was okay. She hadn't expected any. She typed one more note to herself. Remember this feeling. Remember that sometimes the answer is just to sit, to wait, to let yourself be in between, to trust that the path continues even when you can't see it. Then she put her phone away, pulled her cardigan tight, and settled in to wait for nothing in particular. Just existing, just being, just present in this moment, on this platform, on this rainy night, while the world turned and time passed and life continued its mysterious unfolding. And in that waiting, in that simple presence, Elise found something she hadn't expected to find. Not answers, not solutions, not clarity about what came next, but peace. The peace of knowing she didn't need those things right now. The peace of being exactly where she was, exactly as she was, without demanding more from herself than simple existence. It was enough. For tonight, it was enough. And tomorrow she'd figure out, one step at a time, one moment at a time, building the path as she walked. But for now, just this, just rain and light and strangers and the permission to simply be. The train arrived at 12 minutes past 1. Morgan watched it pull into the station across the tracks, a sleek modern thing, all silver and glass, humming with electric power. The doors opened. No one got off. After a moment, they closed again, and the train pulled away, disappearing into the rain and darkness as smoothly as it had arrived. Morgan didn't board it. Neither did the other two people on the northbound platform, the woman in the green sweater, the person who'd been standing at the far end and was now sitting again. They all just watched it come and go, and then continued their separate waiting. What were they waiting for? Maybe nothing. Maybe that was the point. James, on the southbound platform, watched the train arrive at his platform, watched the doors open, the interior lights bright and warm and inviting, watched them close again, watched the train depart. He'd let 3 trains pass now. Or was it 4? He'd stopped counting. It didn't matter. He wasn't ready to leave yet. Wasn't ready to return to his apartment, to his regular life, to the ordinary rhythm of days. Not yet. A little longer. Elise felt the vibration of the train through the platform beneath her feet, watched it slow, stop, wait, depart, felt its absence more than its presence. She thought, I could have boarded. I could be going somewhere right now. But she also thought, I am somewhere right here. And that's enough. The three of them, Morgan, James, Elise, sat on their respective platforms, wrapped in their own thoughts, their own silences, their own private reckonings with whatever had brought them to this station on this night. And across the tracks from each other, separated by steel and distance, but connected by choice, by timing, by the strange synchronicity of needing the same kind of space at the same moment, they existed together. Not speaking, not connecting, not even acknowledging each other directly, but present. All of them present. All of them here. And in that presence, in that shared solitude, something passed between them, something wordless and gentle, some recognition of common humanity, of shared struggle, of the universal experience of being alive and uncertain and trying to figure out how to keep going when nothing is clear and everything is complicated. The rain had stopped completely now. The air was still, quiet, clean. The city sounds seemed far away, distant traffic, the occasional siren, the ambient hum of urban life at its lowest ebb. James closed his book, stood, gathered his things, walked to the edge of the platform one more time, looked across at the northbound side. The two people there were still sitting, still waiting. He raised his hands slightly, not quite a wave, just a gesture of acknowledgement. Hello, good night, thank you for being here. Neither of them saw it. Or maybe they did and chose not to respond. Either way was fine. James walked down the stairs through the main hall, noticing that the person who'd been sitting inside was gone now, the bench empty, and out into the night. The rain had stopped, but everything was wet. The streets gleamed. The air smelled like earth and metal, and the particular freshness that comes after rain has washed the city clean. James walked slowly, in no hurry, thinking about the evening, about the poetry he'd read, about the strangers on the platform, and the way they'd shared space without sharing anything else. Thinking about his life, his choices, the gap between expectation and reality. Thinking that maybe it was okay, all of it. The solitude and the uncertainty and the quiet Thursday nights at train stations. Maybe this was his life, not what he'd imagined, but real nonetheless. Valid nonetheless. Good, even. In its own strange way, good. Morgan stood eventually, though they weren't sure exactly when. Time had gotten slippery again, unmeasured, unmarked. They picked up their umbrella, even though the rain had stopped, walked to the stairs, descended, passed through the warm hall, stepped outside. The city was quiet. The world was still. Everything felt washed clean, renewed, given another chance. Morgan started walking home, taking their time, feeling their feet on wet pavement, breathing the clean air, thinking about nothing and everything, thinking that maybe tomorrow would be different, or maybe it would be the same, but they'd see it differently. See possibility where before they'd seen only adequacy. See choice where before they'd seen only obligation. Maybe they'd see one day at a time. one moment at a time, one step, and then another, and then another. Elise was the last to leave the northbound platform. She sat until nearly 2, until the next train came and went, until she was certain she'd found whatever it was she'd come here looking for. Peace, maybe, or acceptance, or just a moment of rest in the midst of transition. Whatever it was, she'd found it, or it had found her. She stood, pulled on her backpack, walked down the stairs, passed through the empty hall, her footsteps echoing the only sound, and out into the night. The walk home was long, but she didn't mind. The rain had stopped. The air was fresh. The city was quiet. And with each step, Elise felt herself settling back into her life, not fixed, not solved, not suddenly clear about everything, but ready to show up tomorrow, ready to keep trying, ready to build her path one step at a time, even through the fog, ready to be okay with not knowing, with being in transition, with waiting for whatever came next. The three of them walked through the city, through separate neighborhoods, towards separate homes. They'd never meet again, probably, would never know each other's names or stories, would never realize they'd shared that particular Thursday night, that particular rain, that particular station. But they'd been there together. They'd waited together. They'd found what they needed in that liminal space, that in-between time, that permission to simply exist. And somewhere in the city, the train station sat empty now. The platforms cleared, the lights still glowing their amber warmth, but no one there to see it. The departure boards still clicking, updating, listing trains that would come in a few hours when morning broke and the city woke and people began moving again with purpose and direction and the kind of certainty that daylight brings. But for now, stillness, silence, the station resting between moments, between passengers, between purposes, waiting like they'd all been waiting for the next person who needed permission, the next soul who required a place to pause, the next traveler who understood that sometimes the destination isn't a place at all, but a feeling, a moment, a breath between breaths. The city turned, the night deepened, the rain had washed everything clean. And 3 people, Morgan, James, Elise, walked home through wet streets, carrying with them the peace of having paused, of having waited, of having found in a train station at midnight something they hadn't even known they were looking for. Not answers, not solutions, just presence, just permission. Just the reminder that it's okay to not know, to be in between, to wait. That transition isn't failure. That confusion isn't wrong. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply exist, simply breathe, simply show up to your own life without demanding that it makes sense yet. The station lights glowed on through the night, warm and amber and patient, waiting for whoever might need them next. And the rain would come again tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, and someone else would find their way to those platforms, those benches, that permission, and they'd sit and wait and find whatever they needed to find. Because that's what these spaces are for. That's what liminal places offer. That's what in-between times give us. Not escape, not solution. Just a moment to pause, to breathe, to remember that we're all doing this together, even in our separateness, that we're all figuring it out as we go, that none of us have the answers, and that's okay. That's just being human. The night held them all, Morgan, James, Elise, and whoever else was out there, walking through darkness toward home. The city breathed, the world turned, and somewhere rain was falling again, soft and patient, washing everything clean, making space for what came next.